Welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
A new round of police horror stories has surfaced ever since Dead and Roasted started serving out a new police discount. Cops have been getting 10% off their coffee, and boy do they talk a lot when they're waiting for their Joe. Just between you and me, I've been giving them 10% less coffee though. Look, I can't afford this discount, but Regional has been demanding it. Anyway, now time for my break. And that means time for you to hear new and allegedly true police stories about possible serial killers, demonic children, and the thing that lives in the prison. These are tales from the break room. If you're listening as a podcast, follow us and leave us a rating on Spotify and Apple. If you're on YouTube, subscribe to Darkness Prevails for more scary stories. My most terrifying run-in. From WheelerBill. It was 2010. I was a cop for a town nestled along a stretch of lonely highway, the kind of place where big things don't usually happen. We got our petty thieves, occasional bar fights, and the like. Budget cuts had recently hit our department hard, and that meant we often worked solo shifts, especially during the night. One evening, I was assigned to one such shift, covering for a colleague who had called in sick. It wasn't my usual beat, but I didn't mind. The solitude could be nice. Around midnight, I made a mistake that could have gotten me written up or worse, because I realized then I'd left my service weapon back at the station. I had taken it off earlier to clean it. Between that, a coffee, and a snack, I must have forgotten it. A big breach of protocol. Then again, given the low-crime nature of our town, I wasn't too worried about it, so long as I got back and none of my coworkers or bosses knew about it. The night was uneventful until about 2 a.m. I received a call about a broken-down vehicle on an old country road, just outside of town. Dispatch said a man had called in, sounding frustrated, and requested assistance. I radioed back that I would be on my way. I'd driven that road hundreds of times before, a narrow winding path flanked by dense woods on either side. The typical kind of place where cell service can get spotty. As I approached the location, my headlights caught sight of a sedan parked on the shoulder with its hood up. I pulled over behind the car and radioed in my location. I then stepped out of the cruiser. It was a cold night. I reminded myself that I was unarmed, so I needed to be cautious. "Evening," I called out. "You the one who called in?" A man emerged from around the raised hood. He was tall and lanky, wearing a worn-out jacket and jeans. His face was partially shadowed by the brim of a baseball cap. "Yeah, that's me," he replied, his voice smooth and lacking inflection. "Car just died on me." "All right, let's see what we can do." I walked over, acting friendly. I stood beside him and peered into the engine compartment. Admittedly, I wasn't much of a mechanic. "Any idea what happened?" I asked. He shrugged, his eyes fixed on me rather than the engine. "Just stopped running. Maybe you could give me a ride." His gaze was intense, unblinking. I noticed his hands then. Scarred knuckles, dirt under his nails. Pretty intimidating guy, honestly. "Sure, we can arrange that," I said. "Mind if I see your driver's license and registration first? It's part of the routine." He hesitated for a moment and finally responded. "Left my wallet at home." "All right, no big deal. What's your name?" "Daniel." Daniel what?" "Just Daniel." That's when things felt a bit awkward, and I was quickly reminded that I was alone and unarmed, with a stranger who appeared to be quite bigger than me, who was also becoming increasingly suspicious. "Well, Daniel, why don't we step back to my cruiser, see about getting you some help?" He didn't move. "So you work alone out here?" he asked. There was a hint of a smile creeping onto his face. Sometimes, I replied, but backup's never far when I need it. That's so. His eyes narrowed. Listen, Daniel, I began. Why don't you wait there and I'll run your plates. We'll figure out the best way to assist you. He chuckled then. You seem nervous, officer. Something bothering you? Not at all, just protocol. He stepped towards me. You sure you don't want to check under the car? Might be something stuck under there. I took a step back away from him. I'll call for a tow truck. They can handle it. His smile faded. You know it's dangerous out here at night. Never know the type you might run into. Well, that's why we gotta keep a good eye on one another, ain't it, Daniel? I maintained eye contact. More silence. Eventually, he said, Seeing as I'm stranded, how about that ride you mentioned? I weighed my options. Letting him into my cruiser didn't seem wise at this point, but refusing could escalate the situation. Tell you what, why don't you have a seat in your car to stay warm and I'll make a few calls? He glanced back at his car, then at me. Battery's dead. No heat. Alright, you can sit in the back of my cruiser, I offered, mentally noting that the back doors could not be opened from the inside. He stared at me for a long moment before nodding. Sure, that'd be fine. I opened up the rear door for him. As he slid in, I noticed a tattoo on the back of his neck. A jagged symbol that looked familiar somehow. I closed the door behind him, taking a deep breath and walking around the driver's seat. Once inside, I discreetly locked all the doors. I picked up the radio handset. Dispatch, I've got a stranded motorist at mile marker 42 on Old Mill Road, requesting a tow truck and backup. Silence. I tried again. Dispatch, do you copy? Radio troubles? Came Daniel's voice from the back seat. I glanced at the rearview mirror. His eyes met mine. Just a dead zone, I said, trying to sound confident. Technology can be unreliable, he mused. I pulled up my cell phone to try that. No signal, of course. Great. Looks like we'll have to drive a bit to get some reception, I said. I started the engine and pulled back onto the road. The atmosphere inside the cruiser was tense. I needed to keep the guy talking, maybe glean some information off of him. So Daniel, where were you headed tonight? Nowhere in particular. Must be nice to travel freely like that. You from around here? Been on the road a long time. You could say I'm searching for something. Is that so? What are you searching for? He leaned forward. Interesting people. Good conversations. Well, you found me, I forced a chuckle. He smiled. Yes I have. I noticed his reflection in the mirror. His eyes appeared to be scanning the interior of the cruiser. So, officer, do you always forget your sidearm when you're on duty? My blood ran cold. How did he know? I glanced down. My empty holster was partially visible. Sometimes I'm forgetful, I said calmly. But like I said, backup's never far. He sat back. I suppose that's true. We drove in silence for a few minutes. Still no cell signal, and the radio remained useless. Mind if I ask you something? He asked. Go ahead. Do you believe in fate? Can't say I think about it much. Maybe you should, he said. I needed to say something else, take the conversation away from fate. Daniel, is there someone I can call for you once we get reception? Maybe some family or friends? He shook his head. No one waiting for me. Everyone's got someone. Not me. But you've got people waiting for you, don't you? I didn't reply. A family, perhaps. Kids? I white-knuckled the steering wheel. Why do you ask? Just making conversation. We approached a gas station, the only one for miles. But the lights were off, of course closed for the night. Let's stop here. Unfortunately, it's closed. Even so, might be worth checking. Maybe they got a payphone. I was hesitant, but decided maybe there was someone still in there, and they were just closing up. I pulled into the lot, parking near the entrance. Wait here. I'll see if anyone's around. As I reached for the door handle, he said, I think you should stay. I paused. Why's that? He leaned forward again, his voice low. Because if you step out of this car, you won't be coming back. I turned and faced him directly. Are you threatening me, Daniel? No, sir. Just an observation. My heart was pounding like it was going to explode. I had to do something to defuse this. Daniel, if there's something you want to tell me, now's the time. He smiled that thin smile again. You know, officer, sometimes meeting the right person can change everything. I nodded slowly. I agree. Maybe we can help each other. Maybe. Look, if you're in some kind of trouble, I can help you. But you gotta be honest with me. He seemed to think for a moment, then said, You seem like a good man. Honest, hard-working, family man, perhaps. I swallowed. Yes. He sighed. It's been a long time since I talked to someone like you. Let's keep talking. Tell me about yourself. Not much to tell. Made some mistakes, took some wrong turns. Well, everyone deserves a second chance. He looked out the window. Do they? Absolutely. He went quiet again. Eventually, he said, I think this is where we part ways. I was confused. What do you mean? Before I could react, he opened the door, stepping out. I couldn't breathe. As I said, those doors are not supposed to open. But he opened that door and he stepped out, beginning to walk away. Wait, Daniel, I called after him. He was walking into the woods beyond the gas station. I climbed out of the car, debating whether to follow him. Unarmed and isolated, it seemed like a bad idea. Daniel! I shouted. He turned back briefly and said to me, Take care, officer. Cherish what you have. And with that, I never saw Daniel in person again. I stood there. The night felt colder than it had before. I wanted to go after him, but something held me back. And I think that something was fear. I admit it, I was more scared than I'd ever been. I don't think I've ever met a man as scary as Daniel. I got back in the cruiser, trying the radio again. After a few tries, someone replied. I sighed with relief. I told him I'd been trying to get in touch. Copy that. We've been trying to reach you. Everything all right? I had some trouble, encountered a stranded motorist, but he's gone now. Understood. Be advised, state police have issued an alert about a suspected criminal in your area matching the description of a drifter involved in multiple homicides. Exercise caution. In that moment, it felt like my heart dropped right out of my body. All I could do was mutter a "Roger that" and put the handset back where it went. I drove back towards town, and when I felt safe, I reported the man I saw, Daniel, giving them all the details. Backup was dispatched, searching the area I'd been and where I'd last seen him. But Daniel was never found, not here. To this day, I believe that my words during that encounter, showing empathy, engaging him in friendly conversation, may have saved my life. If I'd acted differently, who knows where I'd be now. This experience changed me. I don't take things for granted as much anymore, and I always remember that sometimes the most critical tools an officer can have aren't his weapons, but his words. I don't know if Daniel's still out there, but I gotta say, I kinda feel grateful for the guy, strengthening my resolve, wanting to help people more than ever. I'll end this story here and just say, be nice and understanding to your fellow man, because you may be talking to a serial killer. Annie, from Hired Gun 02. I've been retired for some time now, but my grandkids always want to hear stories about when Grandpa was a cop. I always have a story too, but this is one I never tell them, nor their parents. I worked for a medium-sized department in West Virginia. As I worked, it became apparent that I had this ability to communicate with emotionally disturbed people, EDP. Soon I was trained by the FBI as a crisis negotiator. I was a sergeant by this time, and my patrol officers would call me to help with touchy calls that could become violent. I was asked at one point to assist at a shoplifting call at a large grocery store. When I arrived, the officer said, "It's Annie, and she's wound up." Annie was a local homeless woman who was also an EDP. When I walked into the security office, she was cursing at the store security officer. Annie could make a sailor blush, to say the least. I just stared at her until she stopped and said, "What?" I asked if she had stolen something. She lowered her head and mumbled, "Yes." I asked why, and she yelled at me. "I was hungry." I told her, "Annie, you've been arrested for shoplifting. You have to go to the county jail. Do you want me to take you?" She said she did, so I cuffed her and put her in my cruiser, number 14. Annie had a thing for Stetson cologne. She would douse herself in the stuff. I had to roll the windows down just to breathe. I looked back and Annie was asleep. I pulled into KFC and got her a 2-piece and a biscuit. I backed into a parking space under a light. I got out to take her cuffs off. She woke up and started to scream that I was going to assault her, if you catch my drift. I got back in and locked the doors and sat while Annie ate. It was an ordeal with the Stetson filling the car. I booked her into the county jail to await the night magistrate. The jail deputies just said thanks as he covered his nose with his handkerchief. Time went by and Annie continued to get arrested. She would ask for me by name, so I would take her to jail and KFC. Before long, I was promoted to lieutenant and became a shift commander. My cruiser number 14 was recycled into the patrol fleet, and I was issued an unmarked car. One evening, a call went out about a fatal car-pedestrian crash. When I arrived on the scene, I realized the dead pedestrian was Annie. She had quote-unquote stolen some ketchup packs from a fast food place, ran out the door into traffic, and was struck. I looked down at her, thinking maybe she wouldn't be hungry anymore, and would have all the Stetson she desired. I remember murmuring, "Her suffering's over." I got back into my car and drove back to the station. Later in the evening, I was approving reports when dispatch called me, saying there was a problem in our fenced-in police vehicle lot. A young deputy returning to the county jail had seen someone sitting in the rear seat of car number 14. I was called by one of the officers who went to check it. "Lieutenant, you better come down here." I made my way to the lot and saw them standing by number 14. They had unlocked the doors and they were open. When I walked up, an older officer said, "Check the back seat, Lieutenant." I leaned in and immediately smelled Stetson cologne. I stepped back and just stood there. I looked at the older officers, who just said, "Yeah." I suppose that the door could have lingered since the last time Annie was in the car, but before we all jumped to that conclusion, you should know I had parked that cruiser 6 months ago. I really don't have an answer to this. It became kind of a legend that training officers would tell the rookies on the midnight shift. Though I've been retired for over 20 years now, I'll never forget that night. Was it Annie? Do you think it was? I honestly don't know. Department store calls. From Anonymous. I moved to this city about a year before these events, hoping for a fresh start. My old precinct was fine, but I needed a change of scenery. Plus, my leg had been giving me trouble off and on since an old injury flared up again. Figured a new place might help me get back on track. A new, slower place for the sake of my leg. I got assigned to a beat that included a stretch of downtown with some old buildings and a big department store that's been around forever. And it seemed like a quiet enough area, mostly just tourists and shoppers during the day. But the weird stuff started about 6 months after I settled in. It was a Tuesday night when we got the first call. Dispatch said there was a possible break-in at the department store. Alarms had been triggered, but no one had reported seeing anything. I was closest, so I told them I'd head over, and I did just that. The place was all lit up when I arrived, the big display windows casting a glow onto the empty street. The manager, I'll call him Mr. Glum because he always seemed pretty glum, met me at the front entrance. That night he was kind of jittery, glasses slipping down his nose, keys jangling in his hand as he unlocked the door. "Sorry to drag you out here, officer," he told me. "Maybe some sort of glitch or somebody forgot something somewhere. Alarm's been acting up." "No worries," I replied. "Mind if I take a look around just to be safe?" He said that would be fine. He let me inside. The store was really quiet, the kind of silence that makes your footsteps sound way too loud. Rows of neatly arranged clothes, perfectly stacked shoes, and those mannequins, all lined up like soldiers at attention. We walked through each department, but nothing seemed out of place just yet. There was no sign of a forced entry, no broken glass. But then we made it to the women's wear section. Some of the mannequins looked off. One had its head turned completely around, facing backward. Another had its arm raised, pointing towards a corner. Mr. Glum frowned. "That's odd," he muttered. "I wonder if some kids got in here before closing and messed with them. I'll have a talk with staff." "Could be," I said. I finished my sweep, finding nothing else out of the ordinary, and headed out. I chalked it up to a false alarm and went back on patrol. Everything was fine and dandy until a week later. Same deal. Dispatch called me in the middle of my shift. Alarm at the department store had gone off again. This time I was already nearby. I grabbed a coffee to keep me going through the night and got there in a few minutes. Mr. Glum was waiting outside, looking more frazzled than before. Third time this week, he said, shaking his head. It's getting ridiculous. Third time, I wondered. Really? I only got called out here once so far. He sighed. Yeah, the system went off 2 nights ago, too. We didn't bother calling that one in since, well, nothing happened last time. I sipped at my coffee and told him we should go check it out. Together, we went inside again. The store was just as quiet as last time. We headed straight to the women's wear section, and this time, the mannequins were arranged in a circle, all facing inward at one another. In the center, however, was one of the child-sized mannequins, the kind they use for kids' clothes, sitting cross-legged on the floor. That was a bit unsettling, but nothing some kids who wanted to freak out the staff wouldn't do. What do you think of that? I asked. Mr. Glum looked at me. I just don't understand how anyone's getting in. The doors are locked, and the security cameras aren't showing anything. And I had the staff double-check that the mannequins were all sorted out properly before they left. I perked up when he mentioned the cameras, so I asked if I could take a look, and he nodded, leading me to his office. On an old monitor, he pulled up the recordings. Sure enough, from the time the store closed until we arrived, there was no one there. Nothing strange. No movement, no shadows, nothing that could explain how the mannequins got rearranged. Well, I'll report this, I told him. Maybe increase my patrols around here at night. He thanked me, looking relieved but still stressed out. In the back of my head, I thought, if there was some intruder getting in, and I didn't think there was, at least they were just messing with mannequins. But if it wasn't just some prank, it was probably the staff themselves. Maybe they wanted to freak Mr. Glum out. I left the store that night, finding my different explanations and theories kind of funny. Maybe Mr. Glum was a horrible boss, and the teenage employees were getting back at him. But still, it was strange that the cameras hadn't picked up anything, and it appeared that Mr. Glum was the only one with access to those monitors. A few nights later, I was parked near the department store, keeping an eye on things like I said. My leg was acting up that night. A dull ache throbbed every time I moved. I figured sitting in the cruiser for a while might help it out. Around 2 a.m., I caught sight of a flicker of movement near the side entrance. I sat up, peering through the windshield. There it was again, a shadowy figure slipping through the door just as it closed behind. Gotcha, I muttered, grabbing my flashlight and radio. I called in that I was investigating a possible break-in and approached the building. The side door was ajar. I eased it open, flashlight beam cutting through the dark. Inside, alone this time, save for whoever I saw come in, things definitely felt different. And this time, the place was a mess. The displays were disheveled, clothes hanging off racks, shoes scattered across the floor. I heard a rustling ahead, toward the center of the place. I moved cautiously. I remember my leg acting up with each step. Rounding a corner, I caught a glimpse of someone darting between some mannequins. "Police!" I shouted. "Stop right there!" But the figure didn't stop. Instead, they slipped deeper into the maze of displays. I tried to chase them, but a sharp pain shot up my leg, nearly buckling my knee. "Dang it!" I hissed, pressing on despite my limp. As I pushed forward, the sound of shifting plastic reached my ears. It was subtle at first, a quiet scrape or a creak, but then it became more pronounced, the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving across tiled floor. I swung my flashlight around. The mannequins I had just passed by seemed different. Were they closer now? The ones that had been on platforms were on the floor now, but I swear it wasn't that way before. And their blank faces were pointed towards me. I shivered a bit. I was starting to get creeped out. I heard the rustling again, this time behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. Just more mannequins, arms outstretched towards me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. No answer, just the steady sound of plastic limbs moving when I wasn't looking. It dawned on me that every time I turned away, they shifted closer. My rational mind fought against a rising panic. Mannequins don't move on their own. Someone was out there messing with me, moving them and running just out of sight when I turned around. "Come on, show yourself," I demanded. But there was silence. I decided I was done. My leg was throbbing, and I wasn't about to play cat and mouse with some trickster in a department store after dark. I started backing away, keeping my eyes on the mannequins. They didn't move so long as I looked at them. Maybe whoever was doing it didn't want to come out of hiding if they knew I was watching. Reaching the main aisle, I turned and made a beeline for the exit. But the moment I turned away, behind me I heard the sounds pick up again. Quick, skittering noises, like dozens of feet scrambling across the floor. I didn't look back. Out on the sidewalk, I radioed for backup. My whole body was trembling. "Possible intruder at the department store, requesting some assistance." Dispatch then told me that someone was on their way to help. I leaned against the nearby wall, trying to catch my breath. The street that night was deserted. The whole city was asleep, as they should be. The storefront windows were dark, but I could swear I saw shadows moving inside. Within minutes, 2 other patrol cars arrived. Officers McLeod and Bertelli stepped out, both seasoned guys I trusted. "What's the situation?" McLeod asked. I filled them in, trying to keep my voice steady. "Someone's inside there moving the mannequins around. They keep breaking in after dark, but I'm pretty sure I saw someone go in there. They should still be in there, too. Never saw them come out." "Did you get a look at them?" Bertelli asked. "Just a glimpse. Couldn't make out any details." "All right, we'll go in and check it out." We entered the store together, flashlights sweeping the space. Inside, everything was normal now. The displays were pristine, clothes neatly arranged, no sign of chaos. This unsettled me even more. I frowned. "That's not right," I told them. I explained how the place had been a mess just a few minutes ago. McLeod raised an eyebrow. "You okay? Place looks untouched." "No, I'm telling you, someone was in here. The mannequins were moving." Bertelli chuckled. "Mannequins moving? Oh, come on now." I felt frustration boiling up. "Moving like maybe someone was moving them around. I'm just saying, I know what I saw and there was someone in here." We did a thorough search of the store, but found nothing. No intruder. Even the side door I'd entered through was locked tight. None of it made sense. As we left, McLeod told me, "Maybe you're overworked. We all get a little jumpy on the night shift, too." I wanted to argue, but I really couldn't. The evidence at this point was not backing me up. I conceded and nodded, though I didn't agree. Over the next few weeks, there were no more calls from the department store. No alarms, no reports of break-ins. Everything went back to normal, but I wasn't about to forget what happened. One afternoon, I stopped by the store during my day off. Mr. Glum was surprised to see me. He asked what brought me around, and I told him I wanted to check in, make sure everything was all right. "Everything's fine. Hasn't been another incident, but we have made some changes," he said. He led me to the women's wear section. The mannequins were gone. "We decided to update the look. We thought that maybe the displays were attracting the wrong kind of attention." I smiled. That's probably a good idea. As I was leaving, an older woman approached me. She was a sales associate, judging by her name tag. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I couldn't help but overhear. Did you experience something strange here?" I glanced at her. debating whether or not to engage with this kind of conversation. Why do you ask? She lowered her voice. Well, I've heard that years ago, a lady died here. A lady that ran that section. A lot of the staff in the store refused to work that section near dark or closing. I tried to hide my shudder, and I lied. I appreciate the insight, but I don't think the building is haunted. I left the store feeling both better and chilled. If that lady was right, maybe it was haunted. It makes sense why people think mannequins are creepy. Because face it, people, they just are. Even cops are terrified of the black-eyed strangers. From Garrison 422. In 2006, I was a patrol officer working the night shift in a small town that I won't name, but I will say it was in the Midwest. My wife was pregnant with our first child, and she was due any day. As you can imagine, anxiety was through the roof. Money was tight, so I'd been picking up as much overtime as I could. Decorating and preparing the baby's room was not cheap, and my mom and dad had told me how much it cost them just to deliver a baby. And after all these years of inflation, I was freaked out. One particular night, I'd been on duty for over 14 hours, and exhaustion was hitting me like a train. It was around 2 a.m., and the town was quiet. Most nights here are uneventful. Occasionally, we'll get a call about a noise complaint or a suspicious person, but nothing more than that. Not really. I parked my cruiser in a vacant lot near the edge of town to catch my breath and maybe have a quick snack. But the soft hum of the engine and the warmth of the heater made it difficult to keep my eyes open. I was fighting sleep, doing that head-banging thing, when I noticed movement in my peripheral. I ignored it for a moment, thinking it was me being sleepy and going in and out of it. But then I saw clearly a figure approaching my cruiser from the dark. I straightened up, alert and confused. It was unusual for anyone, let alone what appeared to be a child, to be out at this hour. As the figure got closer, I realized it was a young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old. She wore a simple, old-fashioned dress, something you might see in an old photograph. Her hair was long and matted, and she walked barefoot on the cold ground. I rolled down my window a couple of inches. Hi there. Are you okay? Do you need some help? She stopped a few feet away from the passenger side door. Mister, can you help me? Her voice was soft but clear. I quickly told her yes and asked what was wrong. I assumed she was lost or maybe separated from her parents. I need to get home. Can you give me a ride? She said, not moving any closer. I felt a pang of concern. Again, a child this young should not be alone at this hour. Where are your parents? I asked. They're waiting for me. Please, I need to get home. Obviously, something about the situation felt completely wrong. Protocol dictated that I should help her, but my instincts were going crazy about this one. Okay, why don't you come closer this way so we can talk? She remained motionless. You have to invite me in the car. I can't get in unless you say I can. My eyebrow raised, and I felt some goosebumps. What do you mean? You can come over here, I'm not going to hurt you. Just tell me to get in your car. She insisted. I glanced around. The streetlights nearby were dim, and there was no one else in sight. My cruiser suddenly felt like the only safe place in this otherwise empty world. What's your name? I asked. She waited a little too long to answer before finally saying, Amanda. All right, Amanda, I replied. Where do you live? Maybe I can call someone to come get you." She shook her head. "No, it needs to be you. Invite me in, please." Her insistence on being invited was unnerving. Then it happened. Headlights from a car passing by illuminated her face. It was the first car to pass by in such a long time, and if it hadn't, I dare not think about what would have happened to me, because I saw her eyes that were completely black, dark voids like pits dug into her face. I felt a knot form in my stomach, like I was going to throw up. "Amanda, I need to know where your parents are. I can call them for you." She stepped closer. "They'll be worried if I don't come home soon. You have to let me in." My hand moved instinctively to rest on my holster, not drawing my weapon, but feeling reassured. In the same moment, I felt completely ridiculous and stupid. This girl couldn't have been more than 9 years old, and there I was, prepared to grab my gun. "Why don't you wait right there and I'll radio for someone to come help us," I said. I reached for the radio, but all I got was static. I started to adjust the dial, but oddly enough, every channel was the same, just white noise. And then I began to hear the cruiser's engine sputter and die. The lights on the dashboard flickered and went right out. The heater stopped blowing. What was happening? I began to panic. I tried the ignition, but nothing happened. My car wouldn't start. I remembered my cell phone. I pulled it from my pocket, but the screen was now black. It wouldn't turn on. I remember charging it on my most recent break. "You can't leave me out here." Amanda's voice was right next to the passenger window. I turned to look at her. She was closer now, her face nearly pressed up against the glass. Those black eyes were clear even without a car passing by, and they were staring at me. I'm sorry, I can't let you in." Her expression didn't change. "You have to." I felt trapped. Something was so very wrong and unnatural here, and I didn't know how to handle it. Training didn't cover stuff like this. "Amanda, I'm going to step out, and we can talk, okay?" I reached for the door handle, but hesitated. A deep, unknown sense of dread told me that leaving the cruiser was not only a bad idea, but it might be my last idea. She tilted her head slightly. "It's cold out here. Please let me in." "I can't do that." Her lips parted into a slight frown. That freaked me out. It was the first true emotion that I saw on her face. And then she said, "Then they will be here soon." "Who?" I asked. She didn't answer this time. Instead, she stepped back and pointed toward the darkest part of our surroundings. I followed her finger, but I didn't see anything. "Amanda, who are you talking about?" "All you had to do was invite me in. You should have listened." I had no idea what was happening, or what was about to happen. My heart was pounding, and I tried the ignition again. The car was still dead. I hit the horn, but no sound came out. "Are you going to let us in?" she said. I felt trapped. I couldn't call for help, couldn't drive away, and leaving the cruiser felt like it would be a death sentence. "Please go away," I managed to say. "Not until you let us in," she said, and that time I swear I heard a second voice. I closed my eyes as tightly as I could. A faint tapping on the window made me open my eyes. Amanda's face was inches from mine, only some glass separating us. "I won't let you in," I declared. Amanda's face changed then. Her face twisted into a scowl. She then screamed at the top of her lungs. It was so loud, like she was inside the car with me. I had to cover my ears. I began to look all around, afraid that she had gotten in even though I'd been watching her right there. And when I looked back, Amanda was gone, the scream replaced by silence. In an instant, the heaters in the cruiser turned back on. The dashboard lit up, and I quickly tried the ignition one more time. The car started. I'd never felt so happy. I didn't waste a moment. I put the cruiser in gear and sped away, heading straight back to the station. When I made it back, before getting out, I kept wondering, was I supposed to report this? Or was this an incident that stayed with me? In the end, that's what I went with. I didn't want to risk being labeled as unstable, especially with a baby on the way. The following day, with the courage afforded by sunlight, I checked the area where I'd seen Amanda. There was no sign of children or anything unusual. I still work nights sometimes. I've never seen anything like that again, but it might be because I'm much more cautious. I don't park in vacant lots. I stay where it's lit and where people might be up still. And if I can't find a place like that or I feel too alone, I start driving. Because nothing is going to happen to me so long as I'm behind the wheel and I'm pressing the pedal down. I still wonder what the heck Amanda's problem was, and if she was even human. It lives within the prison. From Swelterskelter. I work as a corrections officer in a state prison, and I've been working here for about 5 years now. My nights include routine patrols, checking cells, making sure everything is in order. I first started the night shift a few months back. I was assigned when the administration said they needed experienced officers for the night, and I didn't mind the change. One of the first things I noticed during night shifts was these stories circulating among the inmates. Typical gossip and threats and such like that. But there was also something different floating about. It sounded silly at first, but then I wasn't so sure. The inmates seemed to really believe it. You see, there was a legend about something lurking in the old wing of the prison, the section that had been closed off years ago due to structural issues. The inmates called it the Crawler. I dismissed it at first as typical prison folklore. Prisoners will not only make up stories to pass the time, but also convince themselves into believing them, because it beats being bored. Plus, these stories often spooked the newer guys. One night, I was doing my rounds when an inmate named Marcus stopped me. Marcus was usually quiet and kept to himself. "Officer, can I talk to you?" he asked, eyes darting around. "What's on your mind, inmate?" I replied. "Have you seen it yet?" "Seen what?" "The thing that's been crawling around at night. Some of the guys say they've heard it scratching in the walls." I sighed. "Those are just stories, inmate. Probably rats or the old pipes making noise." He shook his head vigorously. "It's not just rats. It's something else. Just be careful on your patrols, okay?" I gave him a reassuring nod and continued my rounds. Later that week, I overheard 2 other inmates talking in low voices. "Tommy saw it last night," one whispered. "You're kidding. What'd he say?" The other replied. "Said it was in the shadows near cell block D. Moved like nothing he's ever seen." I made a mental note. Cell block D. That was near the old wing. Again, I tried to brush it off, but the frequency of these stories was increasing. A few nights later, I was in the control room with another officer, named Carla. We were monitoring the cameras when she pointed at one of the screens. "Did you see that?" she asked. I said no, and asked what she meant. "I thought I saw something moving around near the old wing entrance." I looked at the screen. The corridor was dimly lit. We only kept minimal lighting in that area. Probably just a glitch, or at worst, an inmate that shouldn't be there, I theorized. Maybe, but these cameras have been acting up a lot lately. Tell maintenance to check it out. And that was that. That night, as I made my rounds near the old wing, I noticed something odd. One of the doors that should have been locked was slightly ajar. I approached it cautiously, shining my flashlight into the darkness. "Hello in there," I called out. There was silence. I went in. The old wing was officially off limits, but if an inmate had managed to get in here, it could be dangerous for everybody. The air inside smelled old, carrying the scent of damp concrete and rusted metal. The cells were empty, bars covered in a thin layer of rust. As I walked in deeper, I heard a faint scratching noise. I paused, listening closely. It seemed to be coming from one of the cells up ahead. I approached it slowly. The door was closed, but there was a large hole in the back wall, roughly the size of a manhole. It looked like the result of years of erosion, or perhaps an abandoned maintenance project. Shining my light into the hole, I couldn't see much, just darkness stretching beyond the beam's reach. But then I saw it. Movement. Something shifting just out of sight. "Hey, who's down there?" I demanded. No reply. A sudden rush of air blew past me, and for a split second, I thought I saw something. A pale, contorted thing, moving on all fours, darting across the cell and disappearing into the hole. My heart pounded in my chest. I stepped back, unsure of what I'd just witnessed. I decided it was probably time to leave. As I turned to exit the cell, I heard the scratching coming again, louder than before. I speed-walked away. Back in the control room, I found Carla. "Did you go into the old wing?" she asked. "Yeah, I thought I saw someone in there." She looked concerned then. "Did you find anything?" "I think I just saw a stray animal. Maybe a raccoon or something got in." She frowned. "Well, be careful. That place gives me the creeps." Over the next few nights, the atmosphere in the prison grew tense. More inmates were talking about the crawler. Some refused to sleep. Others requested transfers to different cells. One inmate, an older man named Lewis, called me over to his cell. "Officer, you need to do something about that thing," he said urgently. "What thing, Lewis?" "The crawler. It's getting bolder. I know you know what I'm talking about. Last night it was in the ventilation shaft near my cell. I could hear something breathing." "Have you actually seen it?" He nodded quickly. "Years ago, before they closed off the old wing, I swear one of the inmates there got attacked once." I tried to reason with him. "Lewis, there's no record of any missing inmates. You're letting stories get to you." He gripped the bars tight then. "If you don't do something, mark my words, something bad's gonna happen." That night, I decided to check the old wing again, wanting to make sure all the doors were secured. As I approached the same cell with the hole, I found the door wide open. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside. The hole in the wall seemed larger than last time. I heard a low rumble emanate from within. Was that an animal growl? Didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. "Who's in there?" I called. Silence. I contemplated calling for backup, but didn't want to risk sounding paranoid over what could be nothing. Gathering my courage, I stepped closer to the hole. The air seeping from it was cold and damp. Suddenly, I swear, a hand or something that resembled a hand reached out from the dark. I stumbled backward, falling onto the cell floor. Something quick and pale emerged from the hall just halfway. It was gaunt, with hollow eyes and a mouth too wide to be man. it emitted a guttural hiss, eyes fixed on me, before pulling itself back in rapidly and disappearing. I scrambled to my feet and bolted out of the cell, slamming the door behind me. My adrenaline was pumping as I sprinted down the corridor. Back at the control room, I found Carla again. "I think we need to report this," I gasped. "Report what? What's going on?" she wondered. "There's something in the old wing. I don't know what it is, but it's dangerous." She stared at me, trying to gauge my seriousness. "Are you sure you didn't just see a shadow or an escaped inmate? I'm telling you, Carla, it was real. We need to get the warden involved." Eventually, she agreed. We contacted the warden, who arrived within the hour. After explaining what happened, he looked skeptical and a bit angry. "Did you call me down here for an animal? Can't handle a raccoon, huh? At worst, it was a homeless person who found their way in." "No, sir, this was no person. Not an animal either. Not like any animal I've seen." He sighed. "Well, we'll have maintenance seal off that hole and set some traps. I suggest you get some rest. Wouldn't want you to call me back down here for nothing." He didn't believe me, and I could have been severely reprimanded if he thought I was playing a prank or lying. After that night, I decided to avoid the old wing altogether. Just as the warden said, maintenance sealed off the hole and even locked down the old wing altogether. The only folks who could enter were maintenance and the warden himself. And from then on, whispers of this crawler died down. I couldn't be happier. It was a story I didn't want to believe, and the more real it got, the more scared of my own job I got. I don't know what it was or where it came from, but ever since then I wonder if the prison was built over something that shouldn't have been disturbed. I still work as a prison guard there, but I keep my head low and my ears even lower. Thanks for tuning in to Tales from the Break Room, the home of the scariest true work stories. If you want to hear your story narrated by me, send it to me at eeriecast.com/submit. We pay 5 cents per word for accepted stories. Help us grow by leaving Tales from the Break Room a rating and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast app. Check out eeriecast.com or search for EerieCast on those very same podcast apps to see our other exciting and terrifying podcasts, like Unexplained Encounters, the other show I host, where I read stories with a focus on the supernatural. To get some merch, go to eeriecast.store. And to unlock ad-free episodes of your favorite EerieCast shows and exclusive audiobooks, go to eeriecast.com/plus and consider signing up for EerieCast Plus. You can follow me on Twitter, I guess it's X now, at Dark Prevails. You can also subscribe to me on YouTube, where I deliver the same content. Just look for Darkness Prevails. Good night. I hope we can share another break sometime soon.